Erev Tov. Hello, everybody. We're going to start. First things first, please put phones on silent. Very important. Okay. I see some familiar faces, people that are regulars at our events here. For those who don't know me, my name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here. I deal with the English events, and I also run some seminars here and give some lectures on behalf of the center. Firstly, before we speak a little more about the events this evening, I want to invite to the stage the president of the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, Mr. Herzl Makov.
It's embarrassing. I have a screen here that I can see myself. Not bad, considering. Thank you, Paul. Ladies, gentlemen, dear friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening for a very special event, discussing some very important issues. The topic for this evening, anti-Semitism, the Israel-US relationship, and the values which our two countries share are always worth talking about. But for the past 117 days, they have been of critical importance. And this institution, established to commemorate the life and legacy of Menachem Begin, is an especially appropriate venue to discuss them. As many of you will know, Menachem Begin was really the first Israeli prime minister to see himself first and foremost as a Jew. His nationality was Israeli, but his personal identity was Jewish. For that reason, he had a unique connection to diaspora Jewry. He was also proudly committed to the values of liberal democracy, which have been so critical to the flourishing of diaspora Jews, especially in the United States. He viewed the safety and the well-being of Jewish, wherever they lived, as no less important than the safety of Israelis. He understood as well that many of Israel's enemies in the Arab world, as well as at the time in the Soviet Union and its communist allies, were motivated not by geopolitical concern, but by a modern version of the oldest hatred of all, anti-Semitism. When he heard Saddam Hussein threaten to drown Israel in rivers of blood, he heard the echoes of Jewish history. At a meeting with American Jews in May 1981, Begin described what he saw as the main lesson of the Holocaust. If an enemy of our people says he seeks to destroy us, believe him. Don't doubt him for a moment. Never pause to wonder what the world will think or say. It is not a coincidence that the enemies of Israel in Begin's time and today have genocidal intentions. From Iran, which threatened to wipe Israel off the map, to Hamas, whose own founding charter explicitly calls on Muslims to kill Jews wherever they find them. And of course, it is Israel which had to defend itself against this charge of genocide in The Hague. Yes, we are fighting a physical war for the security of Israel and its people and for the return of our hostages. And we pray for the success and safety of our soldiers. But we are also fighting a war of ideas, a war of values. Those countries who joined with South Africa in accusing us of genocide are effectively fighting alongside with Hamas and Iran, brutal regimes that oppress their own people, that target civilians, and that use torture and rape as weapon of war. They are fighting against truth. They are against the basic values which Menachem Begin fought for his whole life, the principles of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. And so, I am delighted that this evening, in addition to hearing from Elliott Abrams and Dennis Ross, two distinguished American Jews with decades of contribution to the US-Israel relationship, we will hear a special recorded message from Bill Maher. Bill Maher is not a politician. He is not a diplomat. He is not a scholar of the Middle East. He is primarily a comedian who hosts a talk show which discusses serious topics, often in an entertaining way. But unlike so many in the vast American entertainment industry, he has neither stayed silent about the war here, nor has he taken the easy position of joining with Hollywood progressive and attacking Israel. Instead, he's done something that has probably lost him some friends. He's defended Israel time and again. And he has done so, as you will hear, because he sees Israel's liberal democratic values as his values. And he understands what should be obvious to all Americans, but somehow isn't, that Israel's enemies are the enemies of America and of every free democratic nation around the world. So, as an Israeli and as a president of this institution, I would want to put on record our appreciation and thanks for his principal support, especially now. I salute you, Bill. I would also like to thank Barbara Diamond, a friend of the Begin Center, who has agreed to be the moderator of our discussion with Elliott Abrams and Dennis Ross. I will let Paul introduce her probably later. His English is better than mine. But she has a long career as a radio talk show host and an even longer one as a pro-Israel activist. And we are delighted to have you here with us this evening. Thank you, Paul, our senior fellow, and thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy this very special event. Good evening.
Okay, so in a short while, we'll be hearing from Elliott Abrams and Dennis Ross. They'll be joining us from the US. It's the middle of the day for them, so and they're busy men, so we have to, they have to squeeze us into their busy schedule. So we're sort of running on their clocks. We have a little bit of time before they're ready. I want to say a few words about some of the things that we've been doing here at the center these past few months, and also maybe just contribute a few thoughts to the issues that we're addressing here this evening. As I said before, I know that some people here are regular attendees of our English events. Some at the center, others are held virtually on Zoom. We actually had an event here before October 7th, just before Rosh Hashanah, where we talked about anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, which turned out to be a rather prescient conversation. As Herzl Makov said, the topics that we're discussing here today are not new, but they have taken on a renewed urgency, I would say. Since that October 7th, our Shabbat Shchorah, we've hosted a 6-part series on Israeli security in collaboration with the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. We've also held 2 of the best attended events that I can remember, one here in person and one on Zoom. We had a lecture on the history of Gaza by Dr. Benny Begin, where he also did a fantastic job of demolishing much of the propaganda that Western media tends to report as fact. And we also had a Zoom panel on the crisis of anti-Semitism on college campuses with American and British Jewish academics, as well as an Israeli student studying at the University of Pennsylvania. By the way, if that university rings a bell, it's because the president of that university was the first to resign following that shameful hearing in Congress, where she appeared alongside the presidents of Harvard and MIT. So I urge you to come along to our events, go to our YouTube channel, just type Begin Center into YouTube. You'll see a bunch of English videos, recordings of all of our events. So please do check those out. We also have, and have had in the last few months, a new series of events for French and Russian speakers. That's not my area at all. Don't ask me to speak either of those languages. But they've been very well attended. So if any of you here speak either of those languages, then you should absolutely check those out as well. In the first of those events that I mentioned, the one about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, I made a few remarks about a topic that I had been writing about and studying for a while, which was the specific case in the UK. Do we have Brits here in the audience? I think I heard some British accent for, yes, fantastic. The case of Jeremy Corbyn and the British Labour Party. And what was interesting about that, I heard that there was a good boo. It's good to have boos when we said, it's like a sort of pantomime villain. It was a sort of test case, right? Because you had it was like a laboratory experiment, right? You had a longtime anti-Zionist, someone whose entire political career had been replete with examples of his real, I'd go so far as to say, hatred of Israel. And he takes over an institution that previously was not, certainly not an anti-Semitic institution. And we saw what happened, right? The result was clear. There was an absolute epidemic of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. You had Jewish members of the party resigning. You had veteran members of parliament from the party leaving the party. The party was investigated by Britain's Equalities and Human Rights Commission and labeled institutionally anti-Semitic. Actually, Corbyn's successor as leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, who, according to polls, looks set to be the next Prime Minister of Britain, very possibly, he actually expelled Corbyn from the party after Corbyn refused to accept the findings of the commission. Now, why am I bringing this up here, apart from the fact that it's always good to remind ourselves of these kinds of things? I think something very relevant to what we see happening in the United States and elsewhere. Like Corbyn and his allies, the progressives who are marching in the streets of New York and London are people who insist that they are fighting for equality and defending minorities. And they insist that's the most important, or one of the most important causes they could fight for. But like Corbyn, they don't see Jews are not on their radar. They don't see Jews as a minority that is worthy of defending, right? They see Jews as white and Western and privileged in the language of the day. And accusations of anti-Semitism must be, according to their worldview, an attempt to shut down criticism of Israel. And Israel, of course, which they see as just a white colonial enterprise oppressing dark-skinned people, never mind the fact that more than half of Israel is Mizrahi, but whatever, only strengthens their view of Jews as part of this oppressor class. And this was brought home to me in quite an interesting fashion. I investigated a little into the Osama bin Laden letter TikTok saga. Does anyone follow this story? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Right, the Guardian published a 2002 letter written by Osama bin Laden to the American people, in which he gives his reasons for the 9/11 attacks. He explains why he did it. And what was so shocking for many people was that these videos started appearing on TikTok, a social media site for people much younger than myself, that went viral, of all these young people claiming that this letter had changed their minds, had made them see 9/11 in a new light. It made them understand where bin Laden was coming from. And TikTok took down these videos, and they banned any more discussion of the letter. And I don't know if anyone's read the letter. I hadn't read it. But when I did, the response from these progressives on TikTok was even more shocking, because actually, the letter is about Jews, first and foremost. If you read the letter, the very first paragraph that all these TikTok bin Laden enthusiasts must have read, the very first paragraph, talks about, quote, the devastating Jewish control of capital, and how a day will come that will enslave you, Americans, if you continue to support the oppressive Israelis in their occupation of Palestine in response to pressures on your administration by a Jewish lobby backed by enormous financial capabilities, right? This is the first paragraph in this letter. And this is what so impressed these young people. This is what led them to question whether maybe 9/11 can be justified or in some way explained away. Now, our two guest speakers will hopefully get more into this question of just what's going on with young university-educated people in the United States. But clearly there is something to worry about. And it shouldn't come as a surprise, I think, that as the progressive left, woke left, as sometimes called, has become increasingly illiberal, increasingly intolerant of dissenting views of free speech, Jews are among the primary victims. I think history tells us that. Herzl Makov said in his speech that Bill Maher identifies his support for Israel with his liberal values, and history tells us that illiberal ideologies are never good news for the Jews. And that goes for left and right, by the way. There are certainly trends on the right that are also concerning. Conspiracy theories spread by popular right-wing figures like Tucker Carlson, giving a platform to anti-Semites, pushing the idea of the Great Replacement. These are also things we should be very concerned about. And by the way, it tells us something about the adaptability of anti-Semitism. I think one of the things that makes it different from other prejudices, while the far left insists that Jews are white, the privileged whites, the far right insists that we're not. Not only are we not, but we're actively trying to destroy the white race by replacing them with black and brown immigrants. Some of you may be familiar with this idea of the horseshoe theory of politics, right? That the political spectrum isn't a line left and right, that actually bends like a horseshoe, and the two ends, the two extremes meet in the middle. And I think that anti-Semitism is one of the points where they meet. But certainly right now, in the midst of this war, it's the left-wing variety that is most worrisome. And though anti-Zionist anti-Semitism is unique in certain ways, it does contain telltale trademarks of other earlier forms of Jew hatred. I'll just conclude with this. One of the features that I think is typical to many forms of anti-Semitism, including this one, was summed up very well by George Orwell, who wrote, "One of the marks of anti-Semitism is an ability to believe stories that could not possibly be true." Right? So Jews were both the purveyors of international communism and the puppet masters orchestrating global capitalism. They were stateless, rootless cosmopolitans, and also they're the only people whose sovereign state is illegitimate. And so we also find in anti-Zionism this curious phenomenon of redefining words and terminology, these new definitions which only apply to Israel or to the specifics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, for example, a Palestinian refugee can be the great-grandchild of a refugee who's never visited the place they're a refugee from. It's a definition which doesn't exist anywhere else. Zionism is apparently racism, even though Zionism's most important and influential thinkers, from Herzl to Weizmann, from Ben-Gurion to Jabotinsky, advocated a democratic nation-state with equal rights for minorities, and that was what was established in 1948. Israel's an apartheid state, apparently, a new definition of apartheid. Okay, nothing like the apartheid of South Africa. The minority population has the vote, is represented in parliament. There's no racial segregation like we saw in South Africa. And of course, genocide. Genocide, right? The only genocide where the victims of genocide have multiplied many, many times in number over the years that this genocide has been taking place, right? The least effective genocide in history. And of course, even though we are actually fighting an enemy that itself has explicitly genocidal intentions. Okay, now I'm just going to end on what I see as a somewhat positive note. I'm going to try and find a silver lining to this cloud. So history teaches us that an anti-Semitic society is a sick society, right? Regimes, political parties, movements historically that are anti-Semitic are also invariably disastrous, not just to Jews. Jews are not are often the first victims, but not the last victims of someone didn't listen to me about the phone, did they? Okay, so Nazism, communism, Islamism. And if there is a silver lining to the cloud that we see hovering over these anti-Semitic, anti-Israel demonstrations and college campuses and other things, perhaps it's this, that it's forced people to look closer at the wider sicknesses in Western societies, right? So the whole insanity and injustice of what's going on at Harvard, I think, is being scrutinized like never before, because people now see that it leads to crazy situations, insane situations, where a professor was recently hounded out of her job at Harvard for daring to say that there are only two sexes, but calling for the genocide of Jews is a matter of free speech. And I think in both Britain and America, people that are not usually involved in any way with debates around Israel or Jews are starting to notice that those who take to the streets calling Israel every name under the sun also don't seem to like America or Britain very much either, right? So in London, the cenotaph, which is Britain's central memorial monument to its fallen soldiers, was scrawled with graffiti by anti-Israel protesters. In Washington, the Lincoln Memorial was defaced with red paint and Free Gaza slogans. And it hasn't escaped people's attention that at pro-Israel rallies in the United States and in the UK, marchers are holding aloft Israeli and American or British flags. So at least for some, I think this avalanche of anti-Semitism that we're going to be discussing has brought with it the realization that the enemies of Israel are their enemies as well. And I think Bill Maher exemplifies very well that to be a friend of Israel is to be true to the values that our countries share. Okay, I will conclude there. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for the conversation with Elliott Abrams and Dennis Ross. Born in the Washington, D.C. area, Barbara Diamond has been a pro-Israel activist for over 4 decades. She had a radio show in Jerusalem called Barbara Diamond One-on-One, in which she did in-depth interviews, which aired in Israel and in the UK. She participated in missions to the USSR to meet with refuseniks. She went to Ethiopia with a medical team to help the Jewish villages, and also to China to open up relations prior to China recognizing the state of Israel. She's been proactive lobbying Congress and helping to start a pro-Israel PAC in Los Angeles. She stays involved through the Jerusalem Press Club, attending up to the moment briefings, which she shares on her blog at timesofisrael.com. You can check that out. Ms. Diamond is the 2018 recipient of the Stand With Us Israel Leadership Award and the author of the dementiadiary.com, a chronicle of caring, which is intended to open up the understanding of the experiences of those caring for a loved one with cognitive decline. Since the atrocities of October 7th, Barbara has been publishing her Israel War Diary to share the personal side of the Israeli experience throughout this war, which has been largely ignored by the international media, focused on the courage and dedication of Jews both abroad and at home to assist one another during this war. It's published weekly in the New York Jewish Press and on 45 pro-Israel Facebook groups with a potential total readership of 1.5 million. You can be among that readership. Okay, Barbara, please join us.
This is too high for me. bring it. Ooh, I just lost whatever it was that was on this. Does it matter? The fluffy thing. Okay. It doesn't matter. Okay. Do I begin without their faces, or do we invite our guests? It is indeed an honor to be invited by the Menachem Begin Heritage Center to moderate this discussion with Dennis Ross and Elliott Abrams, two men who have committed their energies and life's work to United States diplomacy. We have with us this evening, one of each, one Democrat and one Republican. And what I find most interesting is that both men, they're not politicians, they are career diplomats. They didn't depend on promises made in order to serve. Their goal was to serve the presidents that they were employed by. I believe when you hear their credentials, you will consider yourself fortunate to have attended the evening. Dennis Ross served as the Director of Policy Planning in the State Department under President George W. Bush. That is where he focused on US policy toward the former Soviet Union. He worked on the reunification of Germany and was involved in the Gulf War. He worked with Secretary of State James Baker to convince both the Arab and Israeli leaders to attend the 1991 Middle East Peace Conference, which was in Madrid, Spain. He was the special Middle East coordinator under President Bill Clinton and served as special advisor for the Persian Gulf and for Southwest Asia, which included Iran, to former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. He was designated as the United States Middle East envoy under President Bill Clinton. To enumerate all of his government positions and titles would take up most of the hour that we're allotted for the evening, but he is perhaps best known in Israel for having been instrumental in the Middle East Peace Summit at Camp David and for having advised Barack Obama on Israeli-Arab affairs. He worked closely with the then ambassador to Israel, Dan Kurtzer. In these positions, he was often accused by his Arab counterparts of having weighed in heavily on the side of Israel. He has authored books which are widely acclaimed and include memoirs of his experiences throughout his career, specifically the quest for Middle East peace. Mr. Dennis Ross co-founded the advocacy group which is called United Against Nuclear Iran. He continues to advise on their counter-extremism project. Our second guest is Elliott Abrams, and he has held many titles in his career. In addition to being an attorney at law, he began serving American presidents as early as 1981, when he served President Reagan as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizational Affairs. 4 years later, as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. 6 years later, he served President George W. Bush as Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. More recently, he served President Donald Trump as the United States Special Representative to Venezuela, followed by service as the United States Special Representative for Iran, also under President Trump. Mr. Abrams has multiple degrees from Harvard and the London School of Economics. President Bush promoted Abrams to be his Deputy National Security Advisor for Global Democracy Strategy, focusing on advancing democracy abroad. He was supportive of the Iraq War, and he was among those who demanded the removal of Saddam Hussein to be the primary US goal. Mr. Abrams has the esteemed honor of having clashed regularly with groups such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Those clashes were about Reagan administration foreign policies. He was staunchly in the forefront of stopping nations from following communist ideology. There is no way that I can adequately reduce the massive accomplishments of either of these gentlemen into a short introduction. I hope that they will forgive me and that I haven't left anything critically important out, and that we can begin our conversation about the explosive anti-Semitism in the United States and the United States' attitude toward international terrorism. So can we please begin? So I need to have do we have access to our two gentlemen?
Can you hear me?
Ah, Dennis, lovely. This is great. Okay.
I was actually
Would you like
Elliott,
to welcome Dennis
I heard
Ross
Elliott.
and Elliott Abrams? I hope you heard that I gave you really, really good, intros. And I'm sure if I left anything out, you'll forgive me. I did my best. Okay.
No worries.
Okay. Thank you. I would like to ask you each. I'll start. Elliott, you're on the screen right now. I'd like to ask you each the same question to begin with. In your memory, when did you first begin to realize the shift in American attitudes against its Jewish population? And as a Jew, how does the increase in anti-Semitism make you feel?
Well, my answer to that would be first, I don't think there are more anti-Semites in the United States today than there were before October 7th, or a year ago, or 5 years ago. I think, what happened on October 7th did not turn someone who wasn't an anti-Semite into being an anti-Semite. I think that what we're seeing is that people who are anti-Semites are now expressing their views. They somehow feel freer, more liberated to show their anti-Semitism in a way that in years past would not have been true. So that's first. And I think that it's a slightly different phenomenon than the one you're suggesting. At all of the colleges, for example, again, I don't think people's views about Jews or about Israel changed in October. I think they all of a sudden came out in the streets and on the campuses to express those views. And in many ways, I think one of the most terrible things is the number of universities, starting with their 3 presidents who testified in Congress, who made it clear that that was okay, that those views, rather than being despicable and reprehensible, were just free speech, and you got to let the kids go out and say whatever it is they think. I do think that I'd say for me as an American Jew, this has been a reminder that that anti-Semitism always exists. It really exists in every country. And we have opinion polls that suggest it's this level, or it's a little lower, it's a little higher. Clearly, for example, I would say the situation of British Jews is a lot worse than the situation of American Jews. But I would certainly say I have been reminded over these last 3 months that there is a substantial element of anti-Semitism still in the US population, even though we might like to believe, oh, that's a thing of the past, that's 100 years ago. None of that since World War II. It's not right. It's still there.
And so let me pick up where Elliott left off. I would say, just to pick up on exactly what Elliott was saying, I think we all got a reminder that if we thought anti-Semitism had really disappeared, it had not. I think it was latent. I think it was always there. And I think what we were seeing is it's been unleashed. We can ask the question, what unleashed it? And I think, there's multiple explanations for what's unleashed it. I think we saw on the right certain factors that during the Trump administration that contributed to it. And I think we've seen it on the left now, and the trigger of October 7th. I mean, one of the striking things to me is even before Israel had retaliated, we saw the Justice for Palestine and the BDSers were out there defending what had been done, which is in truth unthinkable given the nature of the atrocities. But it was part and parcel of the idea that you try to delegitimize Israel. Israel didn't have a right to retaliate. Israel didn't have a right to self-defense. And this effort to delegitimize Israel and the anti-Zionism that it reflects has always been anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism, because in essence, what it says is, first, the Jews are not a people. Second, that they don't have a right to self-determination. Third, that the state itself is illegitimate, and the Jews who support it are also illegitimate. And this becomes a vehicle for singling the Jews out. Now, what we know historically, the essence of anti-Semitism is always singling the Jews out. And what we've seen that I think has been, it's not that it's necessarily, as Elliott was saying, and I agree with what he had to say, it's not that these feelings didn't exist, but somehow there wasn't a sense that it was legitimate to express these views. And suddenly it became legitimate to express these views and to single the Jews out. And this we actually do see on the campuses. And I don't want to overgeneralize. It's not on all the campuses, but it's clearly on some campuses, it's very prominent. Most of the small liberal arts schools, it's quite dramatic. I came out of the University of California system. It's quite dramatic there. The 3 Ivy League schools where the presidents were testifying, it's clear that it got a kind of license there. What Elliott was saying, the boundaries of hate speech somehow didn't include the Jews, which, I mean, it seems fantastic to say that, but that's the reality of what we saw. So it's not a new phenomenon. It was there. But I think the level of comfort that many American Jews had before October 7th, that comfort is gone. And one of the things that you see, it's, as an example, at my shul, my synagogue, we never had police cars there before. Now we do. A lot of the Jewish institutions here. I used to marvel when I would go throughout Europe that you might have a whole street where there was a synagogue that was closed off. And I thought, well, that couldn't happen. Thankfully, that doesn't happen in the United States. And and now you see lots of police cars. I was appearing at a synagogue in Dallas, maybe 2 months ago, and I was struck by the size of the police presence, and it just it's a kind of reminder that. I mean, the good news is all the local governments, they feel this kind of responsibility. I mean, I live in Montgomery County, and it's very clear there's a commitment from the local government to be quite vigilant in this regard. And that's, on the one hand, it's reassuring. On the other hand, it's a little unsettling that it's required.
I would like to broaden the conversation a little bit, because the only thing I feel is missing from both of your answers, and I would like you to address it, is the impact of extremist Muslim ideology on a nation which has been classically based on Christian and Judaic values. The 2 gentlemen who are our guests and I are the same age, and therefore we have very similar experiences. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, where there was never any Muslim influence, and now the Muslim influence in the United States is massive. So I would like to know, especially regarding those under the age of 30, who I think are not people who had been harboring anti-Semitism like their parents or their grandparents might have, but have come to anti-Semitism through possibly this new indoctrination. And I'd like to know how much you think this indoctrination is bearing fruit. So could we start with Elliott, please?
Complicated question. I think there are different parts to it. One part is the people who are actually promoting this ideology. These are the kind of people who are out on campuses who are demonstrating, from the river to the sea and in favor of BDS and all of this. And it is my belief that a substantial number of those people are not Americans. They are on campuses, they are students from the Middle East. And what is interesting about this is that support for terrorism is illegal in the United States. And you lose your right to be in the United States if you support terrorism. If, for example, you support Hamas, if you demonstrate in favor of Hamas, actually your immigration status should be revoked. And it's quite interesting that at MIT, I believe it's MIT, after some demonstrations, the administration there said, we're going to start suspending people. And then they reversed it. Why did they reverse it? They explained why. Because it would affect the immigration status of foreign students. Well, so that's a contributor here. And, it's my view that the law should be enforced. And that if a student or a non-student, doesn't matter, anyone who is here on a student visa or visitor's visa, who is actually supporting Hamas or any other terrorist group, loses or should lose the right to be in the United States. I think a second part of this is the money that's coming in from Middle Eastern governments, and the most money comes from Qatar. Universities take that money. They take it in two ways. They take it in donations. Here's $1 million. Here's $5 million. They also take it in tuition. Tuition at many of these places is now room board tuition, $80,000, $85,000 a year. Most American students don't pay that. They pay a reduced amount. They get a partial scholarship unless they're from a rich family. Foreign students pay it, either because they come from rich families or because their own government is paying it. That's a cornucopia for these universities. That's millions and millions of dollars more. And it is going to have an effect. It is having an effect on the way those university administrations actually act. I think that's another part to it. And then I'll just stop with the third part, the university faculties. What are they teaching about the Middle East, for example? And I think, it's a widespread view that during COVID, parents woke up because they saw what their kids were being taught, because they were Zoom classes. I think in the last month or two, Americans have woken up to other things that are going on, not in elementary and secondary school, but in college. And we can see some of the things that are being taught now to students about the Middle East, about Israel, are really feeding this anti-Israel frenzy.
Right. So Dennis, can you respond as well, please?
Sure. I would say, look, I think Elliott's analysis is spot on. You talked about Muslim indoctrination, and I would say that's an overstatement. I don't see that as being the driving force of what we're seeing here. Is there an element of that? Sure, but it's not the driving force. I think we have to deal with what has been over a period of time, a reality that the Palestinians have created a narrative, and the narrative is that they are victims, and that the Israelis are victimizers, and that narrative has taken on kind of a life of its own. And to some extent, it's been fueled by some of the right-wing ministers in Israel who, seem to, when you listen to the words of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich as an example, they seem to validate the imagery. So, I think that has contributed to it. But I think the last point Elliott made may be among the most important, at least as it relates to the campuses. I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, even 20 years ago, a lot of the younger faculty who were being hired had a worldview. And the worldview was related to the concept of white privilege, inequality, oppressor and oppressed. And this is what they began teaching. And then many of them, they got tenure, and then they were the ones who were on the hiring committees, and then they hired people who reflected this same worldview. That's what I think has created a kind of momentum on the campuses behind this. And look, you think about it, you put a student there, they have their professor is teaching this, and you're asking the student to stand up to the professor. It's an unequal relationship. So it tends to perpetuate what I think is a set of, what is being taught and what is kind of the tyranny of what's acceptable to teach and what becomes acceptable speech on campus and what isn't acceptable speech on campus. So you suddenly have a reality on campuses that the idea of free speech, real free speech, is lost. The idea of dialogue is lost. And if you are expressing a point of view that doesn't fit what is this kind of orthodoxy, you're shunned aside, or there's pressure put on faculty who reflect that. If you standards, sort of objective standards of what would be acceptable from an academic standpoint are somehow, the whole perspective is lost. So I think, we need to, that is, I think, one of the fundamental problems on the campuses, and it's what administrations are facing. What they're also now facing is they're facing big donors who are saying, don't count on me continuing to provide the kind of money I provided you before, because what I see happening on the campus isn't acceptable to me. And how this will all play out, I think, is partly, I think there's a greater awareness of this reality, and maybe over time that awareness can help to undo it.
Okay, so you're both responding to the environment on university campuses and the kind of Israel attitude that's being taught by professors. And I agree with you completely on this. But going a step further, why do you feel that this young demographic is so enthusiastic about supporting Hamas murderers and rapists? People, they burn people alive, dismember human beings, abduct our innocents. Why do you think that this kind of bestial response to bestiality came out? Is this the fault of universities? What do you think has made American youth so heartless and lacking in empathy?
Dennis can go first.
Please. Okay. I should have said.
I always like to be with Elliott.
Okay, Dennis.
Look, I think, honestly, part of this is a kind of willful ignorance. They just don't know the facts. Where are they getting the information? It's a very distorted prism through which they see things. There is a kind of denial. I mean, it was one of the interesting things to me, and one of the most, I think, disturbing things to me, was how quickly there was a denial that there were any atrocities. Look, we have people on both the left and the right in this country who live in kind of a world of their own. It's a fact-free world. Anything that doesn't fit the preferred narrative is not accepted. The only news they get is from those sources that validates their view, and they're simply not exposed to reality. I mean, I will say, one of the things I was constantly pressing when I was in Israel, I was constantly pressing to get the government to release the videos, these videos that the Hamas people were taking themselves. And one of the reasons was, to counteract this sort of counter narrative. Well, there were no atrocities, and the denial of fact, the denial of reality is one of the things that we have to confront. And that means you present. I get back to what I said, earlier. You have to be presenting facts. I still wish. I know that there's a 4-minute video. I know there's a 23-minute video. I know there's a 47-minute video. At a minimum, I think the 4-minute videos ought to be circulated to all the networks here, multiple networks, because if multiple have them, one of them will feel if they don't run it, others will. And it's not that this is going to suddenly transform everything, but it also reminds the rest of the world why no one can expect Israel to put itself back in the position where it faces this threat next door.
Okay. Elliott, what do you think?
Well, I agree with Dennis. I think, you may have seen that students on some campuses were holding up from the river to the sea signs or asked, excuse me, what's the river? What's the sea? And in many cases, people said, the Nile? I mean, the ignorance is extraordinary. And that's an indictment of American education. So I would argue, I would also hope I'm right in saying that, the number of Americans who are actually pro-Hamas, who are actually saying, nothing happened here, is relatively small, but support for Israel is declining among younger Americans. I mean, every poll shows that. It's a nationwide phenomenon. So why is that? I think it's mostly a problem on the left. And we've seen that in polls, that is, younger Republicans, let's say under 30, are more supportive of Israel than younger Democrats. I think that's partly because many of those people came to adulthood in the Obama years, and they did not have a president for 8 years, for a crucial 8 years, pardon me, who was in love with Israel. I mean, in the sense that you could argue that Bill Clinton or Joe Biden, Democrats had a kind of emotional attachment to Israel. Barack Obama didn't. And I think that those 8 years are, critical for somebody who's now 30 years old. That's where you first paid attention to this, if you paid attention at all. Also is this, as Dennis said, this narrative. Israel's the victimizer. Israel is Israel's in charge. Israel is aggressive. And it's the poor Palestinians who are on the receiving end. They get that in school too often, and they get it in some of the mass media too often. And they get it from the great international human rights groups. You mentioned, Barbara, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. If all you know about Israel is what you hear from them or the UN, it's no wonder you're not enthusiastic.
Okay, I would like to suggest that the demographic that I am concerned about, I think we're all concerned about, is this 18 to 30-year-old demographic, because they're the future leaders of the United States. So I like to focus on them, because I'm wondering whether or not 18 to 30-year-olds really pay any attention to the President of the United States, unless it's Donald Trump and they hate him, and then they do pay attention. But I don't know how much they actually follow the news. We're starting to get reports now that anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian sentiments are being taught as early as elementary school in the United States. And I want you to respond to that. But I also want to mention that the other thing that became clear is that this demographic does not remember 9/11. This demographic does not remember TWA passenger planes exploding in the sky. This generation does not understand why they have to go through all this massive security. They simply have never seen terrorism up front and close and personal like those over 30 have. So I guess my question is whether or not you think, well, number one is any of this being taught properly in the schools? Is anybody in the school systems keeping an eye on how these issues are being taught? And is there commemoration? Is there attention being taught, being focused on these terrible terrorist events? I mean, 9/11 was earth-shaking for Americans, but this demographic doesn't seem to have any connection to any memory of terrorism because they are in America. If they were in Europe, they would have had 7/7. They would have had, even that was 20 years ago, but they would have had more. So I guess my question is, are they totally disconnected? Are we dealing with people that have no understanding about terrorism whatsoever? And if so, what can we do about it? Who's first? Dennis, you're next. Okay.
You know, I think part of it may, I think you put your finger on something. I do think 9/11 is like a historic event to them, but they weren't part of it. And so the sense of threat just really isn't there. I think also I have heard what you said. I've just heard it anecdotally. So I don't know from a statistical standpoint, I don't know from a data standpoint, I don't know what's really being taught in the schools. But like you, I've heard sort of anecdotally some of this. My suspicion is, again, that those who are doing that teaching are probably themselves from a younger demographic, probably under 30. And when they teach something, the theme of social studies or world affairs, they reflect this kind of broader narrative that I was describing. And again, I would have a sense that this probably breaks down between red and blue states, between urban areas and rural areas. I think you might see a big disparity in terms of what's being taught based on geographic location. But I suspect it also is kind of generational. And those who would be in high school, let's say, those would be teachers that are in their 40s might teach something rather different than those who would be 30 or under. You hope the educational curriculum is constantly reviewed. Again, this is probably a state and it's more than that. It's even kind of a city and county level issue. But I am concerned about what's being taught. I think one remedy might be, again, to think about, what we organize, who can be sent into the schools to give talks. I do get requests from time to time to speak in high schools, and I do it. I speak a lot on college campuses. That I do. I will probably speak on 20 campuses this year. And I get 1 or 2 requests a year to go speak at a high school. But I would like to do more of that, because I actually think addressing that population may be even more important. Frequently I get requests when I go on college campuses. I'll hear from students about, they didn't feel particularly prepared to deal with what they were going to confront when they got to college. And what could they have been, what might they have been exposed to earlier, in terms of reading, so they would know more of the history. And that's kind of that should be a story for us about, all right, how could we begin to address that need? Certainly there's a lot of Jewish day schools where more could be done in that regard, but it shouldn't be limited to the Jewish day schools.
No. Okay, Elliott, what do you think?
I was thinking as you asked the question, there was one set of schools in America where I think people are actually taught pro-Israel things. And those are the evangelical schools, where their curriculum is still putting Israel in a special place. And there's a program called the Philos Project that takes young evangelical leaders to Israel. It's like a birthright for young evangelical leaders. I think, AIPAC does some of this too. I think this is a very important antidote. Giving people a 5-pager to read is not going to change their view. But we know from Birthright that as little as 10 days, 2 weeks in Israel has an enormous impact. Now that's on Jews. But I think a trip to Israel for example, every student body president in colleges in America. That's not 1 million kids. It's it's maybe 5,000. Over a period of time, every one of them should be invited to spend a couple of weeks in Israel, because that's the way those leaders, and many of those people are going to turn into mayors and congressmen. That's the way to get them to open their minds to Israel. Be there.
I want to add something to Elliott said, because as he was saying it, it made me think maybe there should be an effort to bring high school teachers. This is a lot of the education might be heavily affected if they were exposed to Israel, and they're almost certainly not. And you could look at those who have responsibility for teaching, the current events or social studies or whatever. I just think that might be something. We haven't thought about that up until now, and I suspect that if you did that, it would have an effect.
I think that's an interesting suggestion. That inspires me, makes me feel a little bit better. If you guys are in Washington, you maybe can make things happen. What we can do is suggest.
Well, we want to inspire you and make you feel better. That's part of our challenge here.
I'd like to change the conversation a little bit toward Iranian terrorism against the United States. So Iran, especially right now, they're not targeting the United States inside the country, fortunately for America, but they are targeting American military bases. They are killing American troops on foreign soil. Iran has, however, been financing a lot of organizations inside the United States to insinuate their philosophy and their goals, to create discord in the United States. It doesn't seem that the United States is addressing Iran as the primary source of what has happened here in Israel and what's happening with the Houthis and what will possibly happen with Hezbollah. Can you explain, or you don't have to apologize, or you're not responsible, but can you explain why America is not focusing more on Iran when Iran is clearly at the core of what we're experiencing? Okay, who's first?
All right, I will jump in. First, you're right in your description. Iran's been killing Americans for 40 years. And they do it, they have this great system for them, right? Through proxies. And they then hide behind the proxies. Why don't we react? We did in 1988. We did in the killing of Soleimani. But basically, you can go through the administrations, Democratic and Republican. And we haven't wanted to touch Iran. And the argument, and it's an argument that comes from the Pentagon very often, you're going to expand the conflict. Don't expand the conflict. It's a mug's game. I mean, it's an Iranian game. And we let them play it. On those very few occasions when the United States has hit back or seemed ready to hit back, in 1988, we basically sunk their navy. When we invaded Iraq in 2003, after the killing of Soleimani, what did they do in reaction? Nothing. Nothing. Blood-curdling rhetoric. But they're not stupid, and they know which is the stronger country. So my answer to your question would be, what we need to do now is not play that game anymore. The message to Iran has got to be, you hit us, we hit you. This does not mean, bombing Tehran and World War III. There's a huge list of potential targets. We'll see what President Biden does now in response to the killing of 3 Americans. But I think the notion that Iranian targets, not proxies, the notion that Iranian targets are sacrosanct and can never be touched, that's the problem. And that's what's got to give way. Until they pay a price directly, they'll keep killing Americans.
Yeah,
What is the chance? What is the chance of that happening? They're paying a price directly.
Well, Elliott raised, we'll see what the president decides to do. But I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the interesting things about the Iranians is that they will fight to the last of their proxies. The one exception is Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is more than a proxy for them. It's the only place where they've successfully exported the revolution. They are, they're like their foreign legion. They train, they arm, they help build a military industrial base of Hamas, of the Houthis, all the Shia militias in Iraq. Right. They all bear an imprint from the Revolutionary Guard, the Quds forces, but also Hezbollah. So Hezbollah has this enormous value to them, in addition to the fact that they see Hezbollah as kind of their deterrent that prevents Israel from going after the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. And they've spent 40 years investing in that. So Hezbollah, they put to the side. And Hezbollah also fights for them. We look what they were the main force on the ground in Syria to save Assad. So Hezbollah is the one proxy that they're not gonna, that they don't want to really lose. But when it comes to Hamas, they were never going to trade Hezbollah for Hamas. When it comes to the Houthis, they'll fight to the last of the Houthis. Kutayf Hezbollah, Saif al-Haq in Iraq, they'll fight to the last of these. But they're very sensitive to their own casualties. They lose a senior Revolutionary Guard officer about a month ago in Damascus, and the supreme leader goes to his funeral. They're sensitive to this, and they have come up with this, from their standpoint, a very clever strategy. It creates plausible deniability. Look, on October 7th, they applauded what Hamas did, but they were quick to say, "Oh, we didn't do it. We didn't know about it." Because that was an indication. They were concerned about what might be the response to them. So they have to, so long as they don't pay a direct price, this is cost-free as far as they're concerned. Maybe there's some pressure from some of their proxies that if you don't stand up for us, maybe we won't do quite the same degree of bidding for you. But in terms of real pressure on them, the only real pressure on them is when they pay a direct price and they feel it. By the way, the notion that automatically, anything that's done to them will create a kind of nationalist coalescence around them. On the contrary, what it does is it highlights the cost that they're exposing the Iranian public to. And we know they have a public that is completely alienated. So this is even something that contributes to what they're most concerned about, which is internal stability. We need to change our posture. I would also, just even rhetorically, why do we constantly say we don't want escalation? Maybe we say it for domestic purposes, but we should, at a minimum, we should not say anything. Let them worry. They need to be the ones who are worried about escalation, not us.
Well, I don't think Iran's very worried about much at the moment. I mean, they've gone forward with their nuclear capabilities. America didn't stop anything. They may have slowed it down minusculely. It doesn't seem to us in Israel, I'm speaking for everyone in the audience, and I have no right to do that, but it doesn't seem that Iran is being held to task on anything, not on its nuclear capabilities, not on its support of the organizations that are, perpetrating evil. Do you see any chance that America is going to become more proactive and stand up where it belongs in this crisis?
Let me give you a kind of political answer, almost a cynical answer. Suppose that we don't now. Suppose that the choice the president makes, presumably he's getting advice. Some people are saying we need to do a lot. Others are saying, no, stick with the old policy. Suppose the president chooses to stick with the old policy and he doesn't do anything to Iran. And we hit some proxy. And 3 weeks from now, or 6 weeks from now, or 3 months from now, more Americans are killed. A lot of Americans, some of them Republicans, are going to say, it's your fault. After they killed those 3 soldiers, you did nothing. And so, of course, they did it again, and it's your fault. I would think the president, particularly in an election year, would weigh that and would think that's a hostage you don't want to give to Iran. So what I'm hoping is that some of the foreign policy advisors say you really have to hold Iran to account, and some of the political advisors say you really need to hold Iran to account. But we'll know in a few days, I guess.
How does that manifest? How would that manifest itself, holding them to account?
Well, my guess is hitting Iranian targets. My guess is hitting Iranian targets outside of Iran. I mean, I think as they try to balance the equities as they see them in the administration, you need to do more. You need to hit probably an Iranian target, but they won't want to go too high up the ladder of escalation. So it'll be an Iranian target in Iraq or an Iranian target in even more likely Syria. That's my guess.
Look, there are dilemmas, obviously. Getting involved in Middle East wars is not a popular thing within this country. On the other hand, losing Americans and looking like you're not responding is not a popular thing in this country. So there's 2 sides of this dilemma. I think the way Elliott answered at the end is probably where the administration will end up. They will do something that is against an Iranian target. Look at the Israelis have taken out 5 Revolutionary Guard officers in Damascus for like a little over a week ago. If the Israelis know where these guys are in different countries, it's pretty hard to believe we don't know. So I certainly think that you may get those kinds of targets. I agree with that. There are a lot of different things we can do. By the way, not everything we do, we have to admit that we did. And they will get the message.
Okay, that's good. Go that way. Okay, that's good.
I'm saying, look,
we just get blamed for everything you do that you don't admit, but it's okay. Go for it.
No, it's better. By the way, it's better than okay. Because what you really want to do, you don't want to, there is an argument for not doing something in Iran that is so overt that they then have a hard time, and you admit it, that they then have a hard time not doing something in response because it looks like they're losing face. But there's kind of no argument to be made against doing something that you don't necessarily acknowledge, but they know you did it. And there's no shortage of targets. And I would also say, they do all sorts of things with us at cyber in this country. Imagine what we could do to them. We could do something with cyber and we don't have to say a thing about it. Okay. And it could be very disruptive and very costly to them. So the point is there's an array of different things we could do that are manageable in terms of the fear about not suddenly getting into a tit-for-tat arrangement.
I want to tell you that I had 20 questions, and not because there's a saying about 20 questions. I had 19 questions to ask you. I only got through 9, and I have been told I only have 5 minutes left. So I want to skip to the last question because I think it's important, and I'm hoping that you will be generous in response. So let's start with Elliott. My question is, looking back on your long careers, with the wisdom of hindsight, were there basic concepts on which you made your decisions or held negotiations on behalf of the United States government, which you feel today have been proven invalid?
Invalid. I would, when you're in government, you probably make 10 mistakes a day, but you hope that there are mistakes on small things that can be corrected soon. As I look back on the Reagan administration, Bush administration in particular, I was in both cases in for 8 years. I think our basic view of the international system, on the threats to the United States, was correct. There are things that we did that I wish we hadn't done. I'll give you one example. The last thing the Bush administration did with respect to Israel was to abstain on a UN Security Council resolution about conflict in Gaza, and we should have vetoed it. So we made mistakes like that. But I think the basic outlook on the world and on the country of those administrations was right. Sorry.
So no, you don't have to apologize. It's okay. Dennis, your thoughts?
Look, if I look back, I always try to learn lessons from the past. Mostly because if you don't, then you're not gonna grow and develop very well. Yeah. Are there things that I wish that we had done differently when I was there in the 1990s in particular? Yeah, I wish that on the issue of terror, I think we should have just shut the process down and made it very clear until we saw the Palestinians demonstrate unmistakably that they lived up to their commitments on this. We should have shut things down. To be fair, I'm not equating what I'm about to say. It's not a moral equivalence, but I think we also should have been tougher on the issue of settlement building, because I think not to shut it down completely, but the fact is, building in areas that would have made it difficult, first of all, to create separation between Israelis and Palestinians. In the end of the day, if we're going to end up producing some kind of coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians, I'm afraid it's going to have to come through separation or divorce, not through marriage. And whatever is done on the ground that makes it harder to separate, that's a mistake. So I wish in both those areas that I had been, more effective and more forceful than I was. I would say on the issue of Palestinian statehood, my attitude has been a one-state outcome is not a prescription. A one-state outcome is something that, from my standpoint, you have two national identities competing for the same space. Neither one is going to suddenly decide they're going to give up their identity. So the idea that you can somehow wish it away, I think, is an illusion. But I also think there's a view that has never been, and again, it gets back to this kind of there's a wonderful, one of the greatest lines that President Bush 43 uttered was a soft bigotry of low expectations. And I think that's the way we have too often dealt with the Palestinians. I won't say who on the Palestinian side said it to me at one point, but it was the most important thing that has not been done. He said, God save us from those who don't require anything of us. You want a Palestinian state? Clark Clifford, I'll go back to the May 12th, 1948, when George C. Marshall came over to see Harry Truman and to argue against recognizing the state when it was going to be declared. And Clark Clifford went through and argued, and he said, look what the Jews have been doing. He said, they've earned the state. They've earned the recognition. Palestinians, I think, they need to earn this.
Yes.
Yes. In the end, I believe, ultimately, I think a two-state outcome is what is required. But I know, no one in the region wants another failed state. No one wants a state that would be dominated by Hamas. Anybody who favors a state dominated by Hamas, they should be honest and say, okay, they don't favor a two-state outcome, because, of course, Hamas rejects a two-state outcome. A Palestinian state can't become a member of the axis of resistance, or what I call the axis of misery. A Palestinian state has to be built on the foundations of coexistence, which means recognizing Israel's right to exist as the nation state of the Jews, not just the fact of it. So, if I would like to have learned, I think what I've just described reflects the lessons from the past that I think I've learned.
I must say that this has been a fabulous conversation. I thank you both for giving us your precious time. I wish we had more hours to discuss more and more details and the other 9 questions I didn't get to, but thank you both. We really deeply appreciate it. And we hope that you're both coming to visit us very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll look forward to the next 9 questions.
And if you do, you're invited to dinner.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Okay, we're going to, that was fantastic. I think you'll agree. We're going to conclude with a recorded message from Bill Maher, the host of Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO. For those of you who don't know him, who haven't seen it, check it out on YouTube. It's sort of sharp political analysis, satire, sharp both in the sense that it's quite sort of harif, as they say in Hebrew, and also I think very spot on in many ways. He doesn't take any prisoners. He says what he thinks. He often argues with his guests. He's also a stand-up comedian, and that comes across as well. But as Herzl Makov said at the very beginning, we wanted to thank him for his stalwart defense of Israel these past few months, and particularly because as the Begin Center, and where we see the importance not just of defending Israel, but defending Israel from the viewpoint of the values that Israel and the United States and the democratic world share, that's very much where Bill Maher is coming from. So we're going to hear a bit from Mr. Bill Maher.
Good evening, and thank you so very much for inviting me to talk to you tonight. I have fond memories of the week I spent in Israel some years ago, and I consider it a great honor to speak at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. Here in America, a troubling trend has been unfolding in recent years as the support that Israel could always count on from America's liberals has faltered. I consider myself a liberal, but as I'm sure you know, I'm not part of this trend. Sometimes people say to me, "You're just standing up for Israel because you're Jewish." But I'm not. My mother's side of the family was Jewish, at least culturally, but I was raised Catholic, and having survived that, I'll be damned if anyone's going to take that away from me. And nobody gets to tell me what I am but me. And what I am is a Catholic-raised atheist. And that actually makes my support of Israel more meaningful, because it doesn't come from tribalism. It comes from the fact that the values that Israel upholds and exemplifies are my values, and the values of the people who attack Israel are not. It boggles my mind that so many people in my country who consider themselves progressive somehow wind up in the streets cheering for some of the most illiberal people in the world. That's why I've tried to use my show over the years, and especially since October 7th, to try and educate my fellow citizens about the history and the reality of Israel. Here's one I did back in December, and while I know you don't need to hear it, if you know someone who does in this world, please feel free to share. Thank you, and long live Israel.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. We have an event next week, a book launch of a great book, Jewish Priorities, amazing panel. Einat Wilf, Yossi Klein-Halevi, Hillel Neuer from UN Watch. You can sign up through the website or on Facebook, or drop me an email, paulg@begincenter.org.il. Thank you very much. Good night.